Welcome to DCQ Dublin City Questions, a podcast where DCU students sit down with academic experts to explore how big ideas from international relations and politics to law and media shape the world around us. We're here to bridge theory and reality and bring university discussion to life, one question at a time. This is DCQ Dublin City Questions. I'm Ciarán Mulryan, one of the student hosts, and before we begin today's show, I have a special announcement. We have an event coming on February 18th at 2 p.m. in CG04. In collaboration with the DCU Conflict Institute, DCQ will be putting on a special panel discussion in which we will be discussing America's recent actions in Venezuela and their push for Greenland. We will have a wide range of experts, including some former DCQ guests. So be sure to mark the date in your calendar, February 18th. More information will be in our social media channels, which you will find in the description of this episode below. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Walt Kilroy, co-director of the DCU Conflict Institute, assistant professor at the School of Law and Government, and former deputy foreign editor for RTE. In this episode, we are going to be talking all about the war in Sudan, from the suffering of the civilians on the ground, to the new ways of reporting on conflicts, to the impact of the Saudi-UAE tensions on the war. All of that is coming up next, so I'm just going to throw it over to myself. Let's begin. Thank you, Dr. Kilroy, for joining us. And just to start off, I'm just wondering if you could tell us what's happening in Sudan right now and who are the current key actors?
Great. Well, thanks very much for the invitation to talk about it. Sudan is really one of these desperately overlooked conflicts, where there are huge, it's been described for quite a number of years as the largest humanitarian catastrophe on the face of the planet. Just because the population is so big, it believe it or not, it actually has much more people directly affected in a really bad way, even than Gaza or Ukraine. But maybe if I just start with a bit of just the location of where it is. It's quite hard for us to understand that, Sudan, it's 20 times the size of Ireland, and it has a population of about 50 million. So let's start with a map. So here's the map of Africa as a whole. You can probably see here, I don't know if you can see my cursor. Here's Sudan sitting in the Horn of Africa, in Northeast Africa. So previously, this was all one country, Sudan, but South Sudan broke away after a long war in 2011. If I just zoom in a little bit, we can see the Horn of Africa. So at the Horn of Africa, so here's Sudan, the neighbors, Ethiopia and Eritrea to the east. And then to the west, let me bring up Sudan itself. So here's Sudan itself. This is the location in Northeast Africa or Horn of Africa. So the neighbors are Eritrea, Ethiopia, South Sudan, which was originally part of the country, Central African Republic, Chad, Libya, and then a very big player here, which is siding with the government, is Egypt. And that's a really significant one because the waters of the Nile, Egypt is completely dependent on the waters of the Nile, and it has a huge population. So here's the Nile, but working upstream, it goes through Khartoum. One branch then, the Blue Nile comes from Ethiopia. That's where most of the water comes from, and another branch comes through South Sudan, the White Nile, originating in Uganda. So Egypt is a big player. It wants stability in Sudan because nearly all of its water passes through Khartoum, and it doesn't want any disruption to that. Population is about 50 million people. It became independent from Britain in 1956. Oil was discovered down in the south. This was still originally one country, was discovered down in the south in the 70s. And that's been quite a long process to bring that on stream with a lot of Chinese investment ultimately. But South Sudan here, it had a war of independence for on and off for about 40 years, and eventually it became independent in 2011. Sadly, it's had its own problems since then, and is also is in a state of war. It's in a real crisis at the moment, unfortunately. But that's a related but different story. So all of the oil from South Sudan, it has to go through pipelines, through Khartoum. There's some oil refineries there, and through to the Red Sea, where it's loaded onto tankers, mostly sold to China. So that's Sudan geographically, the lie of the land. It's also just important to remember, in terms of governance, that it was ruled really by it really was a police state. It was ruled for 30 years by Omar al-Bashir. Do I have a picture of me? Here he is at the African Union in Addis Ababa. Omar al-Bashir, a really strong military leader. He was overthrown. Finally, it seemed like an incredible achievement of civil society. He was overthrown in 2019 after 30 years in power. And this is the really famous image of one of the really courageous leaders. Civil society, they mounted 8 months of protests. As we saw recently in Iran, in Iran, really, the discontent was there, but it was triggered by inflation and food prices, which ultimately ballooned out into wider demands for a complete change in government. And I have to say, I've always been incredibly impressed by the strength and the courage and the articulate nature of civil society in Sudan, despite the fact that they were really living under a real police state. And I mean, people that I used to deal with would be in and out of jail. And it was a very repressive society, but incredibly courageous and effective civil society. This was a really dramatic moment in Sudan's history. In ultimately, the military saw the writing on the wall. They dumped their leader, Bashir. They said they were siding with the population. And in August 2019, a deal was struck for a 3-year transition from military rule. And remember, the military is deeply embedded in all areas of the state. Ultimately, a transition to civilian rule. That was always going to be really tricky. That was always uncertain. And sadly, it got derailed. And there were a number of coups, and the military retook power completely. So that brought us up to the point where we actually saw the military taking control completely, and then the current war in Sudan, that broke out really as a power struggle. I'll just stop the share now because I don't have images related to that. That broke out as a power struggle between two elements within the state. There was the official armed forces, the SAF or Sudan Armed Forces on one side, and on the other side there was a militia which had originated in Darfur and was used and armed by the government there to suppress the moves towards independence, which started in 2003. A really, really brutal government proxy force called the Janjaweed. They ultimately, who were responsible for really appalling atrocities, they ultimately were rolled into the military, were brought in to Khartoum to shore up the military, but they always kept their separate identity and their separate loyalty, and that was called the Rapid Support Forces. So this was really a power struggle. It didn't start with, a demand for like a new society, a new government, people power. It didn't even begin on an ethnic basis. It was basically a power struggle, an elite power struggle between the official armed forces and this proxy group which had been rolled into the state, the Republican, the Rapid Support Forces. And it was a really brutal power struggle between the two, in which the population, sadly, have really suffered enormously.
Thank you for that wonderful explanation of where it's gone. I just want to touch on you were saying how the population's been affected by this power struggle. I know we've seen in the news, for example, Al Fashir was a major event that got a lot of coverage, but I'm just wondering if you could tell us what the suffering is like for the Sudanese population at the moment. I know they're suffering from famine and access to medication. If you could just tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, it's really been on a number of fronts. I guess well, if we didn't learn now, we never would. I mean, I think we're hopefully a lot more aware now about the distinction between, civilians and combatants over the last years with Gaza, and with Ukraine. But really, it's been happening on two levels. One is the civilians getting caught up in the fighting, because some of the fighting was in the capital in Khartoum, and people were. I mean, we're literally talking about artillery and air force strikes. These weren't people running around with Kalashnikovs. So civilians being directly killed, hospitals being looted. Sudan was on the edge anyway in terms of food security, and being so close to the edge, any disruption to that can have a huge impact. So one of the big effects has actually been hunger. So as we can see, the UN has been making it very clear that famine has now been identified in a number of locations across Sudan. About half of the population, more than 20 million people, is in extreme food insecure situations. We've seen massive displacement. Egypt is host to about 1 million refugees. People have fled into other countries that would be regarded as conflict zones themselves, and massive internal displacement. But sadly, we've also seen very, very high levels, really shocking levels of gender-based violence, mainly directed at women and girls, in particular by the Rapid Support Forces, and more recently in the West. I'll just go back to the first map here, or the map of Sudan. If I can get it to move there. In the West, in Darfur, this is the Darfur region. Basically, we've seen the Rapid Support Forces, who originally came from Darfur in the West, taking over one city after another, and they were really extraordinarily brutal. In the last city to fall, in Al Fasher, at the end of October last year, 2025, we saw really, really brutal tactics in which civilians were being directly targeted. And here we saw an ethnic component coming into the conflict, which is so much worse because it's so much more bitter. People are being literally killed for who they are. And it also means it's going to be so much harder, ultimately, when the time comes to move on from this conflict and to heal, because it's been on an ethnic basis. And the Rapid Support Forces themselves were glorifying their own violence, posting trophy videos showing really appalling, literally, shooting of civilians who'd been taken prisoner on camera, appalling stuff, and very widely documented through satellite imagery. It's not that the world did not know. We all knew this was going to happen, and everybody was pointing out this is going to happen. They had built a berm, a big wall, an earthen bank around the capital to stop the population from fleeing. We all knew what was going to happen. We all said this is going to happen, and then it happened. It got very little attention, but I mean, this was really appalling atrocity of civilians being directly targeted.
Yeah, just to follow up on what you're talking about there from the satellite imagery, I know Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab played a critical role in exposing these terrible atrocities occurred. I've seen these brazen videos on social media, but just yourself as a former deputy foreign editor for RT, I'm wondering what you think of the role of open source journalism or these new kind of ways to report on atrocities in war zones, whether it's scouring the internet for social media videos or reviewing satellite imagery.
Sure. I think it's a really interesting development. Like when I was working in, in television news, like, it was actually 20 years ago. I mean, the big question was always how to get pictures out of Darfur. And that was one of the things that I was involved in when I was later on working for an Irish development NGO. Was like, we know what's happening. We can't get the television pictures out. Now with mobile phones everywhere, although internet shutdowns, as we've seen recently in Iran, can make it extremely difficult to get images out. This opens up a whole possibility in terms of accountability ultimately, because stuff is documented for future prosecutions, and we can also see things that are directly happening. And really interesting use of open source. There's some very, very interesting organizations like Bellingcat, for example, that have made very good use of open source intelligence. So the report published last October, as this was happening by the Humanitarian Research Lab at the Yale School of Public Health. Very, very interesting report, very shocking. They made extensive use of satellite imagery. They call it data fusion, where they take data from many sources and do a lot of cross-checking. And one of the things that they did was they were literally at the level of individual killings. They were able to identify using satellite imagery. So, for example, here they've identified groups of bodies, and they can even pick out on the spectrum, sadly, red discoloration on the ground from blood, and they can identify that part of the image that was not there on the same image the previous day, and they've done a lot of very carefully documented. Here they've gone into great detail, and this report is available on their website. They've gone into great detail of where human remains are left lying in the street, discoloration, and they've done a huge amount of work to document. As I say, it's not that we don't know that this is happening, but somehow it's not on the agenda. It's very hard to get people and media organizations to pay attention to this. I know that we're all very understandably paying a lot of attention to Gaza, Ukraine, Venezuela, Iran, but even though the level of suffering is so great in Sudan, it just seems not to be on the agenda. Possibly that might be because it's not seen as geostrategically important in the way that some of those other countries are. It has the mixed blessing of not being regarded as in the backyard of any of the superpowers, but it is regarded as being in the backyard of some of the regional powers. And those regional powers, particularly the United Arab Emirates, who have funded and armed the Rapid Support Forces, they just seem to be getting away scot-free. There's very little public criticism. There's even very little public knowledge, even though it's been widely documented. The UAE denies that it's involved in arming and supporting the Rapid Support Forces, but it's been very, very widely documented. I mean, Rapid Support Forces are turning up with drones, artillery, very sophisticated weaponry. They're very well financed, and they were already very closely linked in to the UAE in terms of gold exports from Darfur. But it seems as if a lot of Western powers don't want to rock the boat in terms of their relations with the significant players in the Middle East. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, all of whom are major players in this conflict, supporting one side or the other. The West generally seems to put a much higher priority on relationships with the UAE, with Saudi Arabia in relation to Iran, Yemen, Israel, Palestine, and the downstream effects of these countries arming and funding of one side or the other in the conflict in Sudan doesn't seem to be a priority. There's some kind of quiet murmurings of discontent, but they're not being called out in the way that they should be.
Yeah, I completely agree. I seen that back in December, the US sanctioned Colombian mercenaries for supporting the RSF. So yeah, it does seem that information is out in the media. We've known for a good few years now that the UAE is backing the RSF, and there's been no sanctions or anything coming down on them. I'm just wondering what you think now of the recent spat between Saudi and the UAE. The Red Sea's become a geopolitically important region for the world, and like that, it kind of seems like around this region, people are trying to pick sides, whether you're with the UAE or Saudi, and just trying to think how that might impact the conflict going forward.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're very well informed. Yeah, this recent spat between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, who were working side by side. Let me see if I can go back to the map of the region. Sorry, I'm just going back to the first map.
That's fine.
Yeah. I think that it's kind of a rupture between the UAE.
Sorry, you're just not screen sharing at the moment.
I'm very good. Yeah, trying to do. There we are. Okay. So I'm going to go back to the region. So here's Saudi Arabia. Now it's just across the Red Sea from Sudan. So it doesn't share a border with Sudan, but it wants stability there. It doesn't want major instability. So who are the actors? Saudi Arabia has been supporting the government forces. Turkey has also been sending a lot of arms and supporting government forces. Previously, Iran was as well. I'm not sure how its continued involvement is going to play out, given that it's lost a great deal of power in the region and is dealing really brutally with internal dissent. But on the other side, you've had the United Arab Emirates here, who've been supporting the Rapid Support Forces. And we almost have a division of Sudan now, with Rapid Support Forces holding Darfur and areas to the west of the Nile, South Kordofan, and then the government, which has moved its headquarters for now to Port Sudan. They retook the capital in 2025, last year, holding the east. And some people are saying, oh, is there going to be a kind of a de facto partition of Sudan? Certainly that's what that's how it is on the ground at the moment. Whether that'll in any way be formalized, we don't know yet. But what's interesting, Yemen, we don't have borders for these countries, but this is where Yemen is. Both Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates had been working side by side in Yemen in opposing the Houthi fighters there. They've now fallen out with each other on the ground within Yemen. Does that have implications? It's possible that it does, but remember, Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, they were on opposing sides on the war in Sudan. They were each backing different sides in Sudan's war. Perhaps if this hostility deepens between the two, we might see them intensifying their support for one side or the other. We might also see what's happening in Sudan become a kind of a proxy war between the two big powers on the Arabian Peninsula. That both sides, that could actually be seen as a proxy war. One of the things that UAE wants is it wants influence in the region. It's a significant player. It really just wants influence. It's too soon to say. It doesn't radically change things because they were on opposing sides in any case, but it's definitely one to watch in 2026.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And I guess I want to try end it off with maybe a bit of a positive question here. You know, you talked about the power of Sudanese civil society. I'm just wondering, what can we do in Ireland to try raise this awareness, to try get the message out there? I know there's been a few little protests or marches, but it does feel like Sudan is a conflict that has been forgotten about, especially in the West.
Yeah, it really has, and you're right. It's important we don't just kind of disempower ourselves. I think that the big hope, and this may seem, people may think I'm being, idealistic, but if you look at a lot of conflicts where civil society has been hollowed out, where there's been like where there aren't, let's say embryonic potential governance structures there. I've always been impressed with Sudan, with civil society there. There's a very highly educated segment within society. There are very, very capable people there of great principle, and we've even seen that, for example, in the response to the war, where like anything, humanitarian access when there's a war is a huge problem, not just in Gaza where it was actively blocked, but simply because it's too dangerous for international organizations to operate. On the ground, there were extraordinary measures put in place by civil society to try to bring in food, to try and provide medical assistance when hospitals were being destroyed and food supplies were interrupted. Ultimately, that gives me a lot of hope, but how do we get there? And remember, things like this may look like, oh, here's another tree hugger, another dreamer, but remember, things can sometimes flip very quickly. Look at how quickly they flipped in Syria in December 2024. I didn't see that coming. I'm not a Syria expert. But I think most people didn't see that coming. We suddenly saw the collapse of the Assad regime. We've seen things flip. It seemed impossible that Sudan would move on from military rule, but it did in 2019. So ultimately, how do we get there? Just stopping UAE support on its own for rapid support forces isn't going to solve this, but it's a significant factor. And one of the things we need to do is ask the European Union and ask the West in particular to hold the UAE to account for its role. Now, there are other actors as well, but that would be the first thing. Ultimately, we need a ceasefire. It may be that this ends up being some kind of, as an interim basis, some kind of elite pact, with one side taking part of Sudan, on the other taking the other part, as an interim, as a way to get there. And immediately after the ceasefire, humanitarian access is essential. Ultimately, a solution that is just and is sustainable is going to have to involve civilian control of the government. That's a long road, but I'm hopeful that there are really inspirational leaders of great principle there waiting. And we saw them doing very careful negotiations in 2019, where they very carefully negotiated a 3-year transition, which sadly got derailed. But ultimately, a civilian government with proper governance structures, and I don't just mean like holding elections immediately, is the solution. The steps along the way are to hold to account those outside actors that are fueling and arming the conflict and funding it, holding to account the internal actors, ultimately a ceasefire, humanitarian access, and negotiations.
Thank you. I think that's a positive note to leave the conversation on there. So I really appreciate your time. And like I said, talking about an undercovered war that needs to get, topics of conversation out there. So yeah, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for shining a light on it.
A big thank you to our guest, Dr. Walt Kilroy, and don't forget about our event February 18th at 2 p.m. in CGO4, all about America's actions in Venezuela and their push for Greenland. So come on and check us out. More information on our social medias in the description below. Thank you for listening.